Welcome to class. First thing I'm going to do, as usual, is share my screen and bring up the class notes. Here they are. Hopefully you can see them. And here we go. Oh, let's get this down there. Okay. Oh, wrong. Now I got to go back. Sorry. Pulled up the wrong document. Now, 1 second. There. All right. So here we are today, Monday, November 14th. Glad you're all here. We're going to do a little background reading for the third essay on the human rights. And on Wednesday, we'll begin to read the Declaration of Human Rights. That first draft of essay number 3 won't be due until November 30th, so you have a little bit of time to actually do the essay. And then we will have a second reading of the second half of the Declaration of Human Rights on Monday. And as I noted last time, this is a change from my original schedule, just so we could have a little break for Thanksgiving. We will not have a class on Wednesday next week. We won't have a class on Monday the following week. So you'll have a little time off for Thanksgiving. And then we'll come back again on November 30th. And that's when the first draft of that essay number 3 will be due. So that's our schedule. Let me just stop for a second, see who's here. Okay, good. And move on. So tonight, what I thought we'd do is introduce the idea of human rights. We've been reading about first the Declaration of Independence and the inalienable rights, which in the Declaration of Independence was the first time that any people decided they were going to try to create a government that was based on the rights of people. Of course, these were Christians, and they were Protestants mostly, and European. And of course, they were trying to become independent from England, a European country. So they based their theory on the rights coming from God. The inalienable rights were given by God: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Then, of course, they won the revolution and they established the United States of America. First time any nation in the world was established based on rights of the people. And of course, they included in the Constitution the Bill of Rights, which we've looked at, which codified, which put into law the idea that there were limits on the government's power, the ruler's power over the people. The people had rights that the government could not take away, could not trample, could not deny. And of course, you wrote about these stuff, so you know all these things. But also that whole Constitution and the whole Bill of Rights was based on the same notion of inalienable rights coming from God. So now we're going to take a look at some ideas. We're going to fast forward in time to a more recent era and take a look at the notion of human rights. Inalienable rights were in the Declaration of Independence. Civil rights were in the Bill of Rights. And now human rights, which are really for everyone in the world. So today we're just going to take a background view of how these things developed. You'll recognize some of these ideas. Some of them will be new to you. All of this is in preparation for you writing your third and final essay, which will be on the actual Declaration of Human Rights. And the next 2 classes will actually read that declaration. There's 32 different articles, so it's rather long. So it's broken up into 2 parts. But here we have the background. Okay, the belief that everyone, by virtue of her or his humanity, is entitled to certain human rights is fairly new, as I just said. Its roots, however, lie in the earlier tradition and documents of many cultures. It took the catalyst of World War II to propel human rights onto the global stage and into the global conscience. So now we'll take a little review of what this introduction says. Okay, so let's start here. Throughout much of history, people acquired rights and responsibilities through their membership in a group, a family, indigenous nation, religion, class, community, state, all of these things did grant people rights. Most societies have had traditions similar to the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Different societies have operated with that kind of ethic. The Hindu Vedas, the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, ancient code, the Bible, some of you know the Bible, the Quran, some of you know the Quran, and the Analects of Confucius, some of you know about Confucius, are 5 of the oldest written sources which address the question of people's duties, people's rights, and people's responsibilities. Now, of course, that's a big bucket, duties, rights, and responsibilities. Rights do come with responsibilities, and people do have duties or things that they must do in order to participate in society or in the family or in the group. But as you can see, this way of thinking about human rights, sorry, I don't know what happened there. This way of thinking about human rights tries to extend the notion of human rights to all of history and to all of the world and to all cultures. Up until now, we've sort of been looking at the very small ideas, not small ideas, but this very local area in the United States where those ideas were practiced. But here you see that the notion of human rights is attempted to be grounded in all of these cultures. And of course, for your essay, you can seize upon these ideas if you're familiar with the Quran or you're familiar with Confucius or the Golden Rule or the Bible. You can use your familiarity with those ideas when you write about human rights, if you choose. You're also going to be able to simply take a look at any 3 articles or any 3 parts of any articles in the Declaration of Human Rights and just focus your writing on that. So you have a lot of choice here. In addition, the Inca and Aztec codes of conduct and justice and the Iroquois Constitution were Native American sources that existed well before the 18th century. The Incas, you may not know, were the dominant tribe in South America. The Aztecs was a dominant group in Mexico up until the 15th century, so for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so again, what this article is saying is that the idea of human rights has broad history. Let me scroll down to the bottom just to show you. Here's the source that we're reading. Okay, this is a particular source written by this gentleman, David Sheeman, called Teaching Human Rights. And it was published by the Center for Teaching International Relations and Publications in 1993. So you can see, this is what I've taken here as a short history from a published work. Scroll back up, and it's not very long. We're just going to look at this together. Okay, so here we are. We're going to start where I left off. Sorry. Okay. In fact, all societies, whether in oral or written tradition, have had systems of propriety, what's right and what's wrong, and justice, as well as ways of tending to the health and welfare of their members. So this idea of human rights is being extended, as I said, to the entire globe, to all human beings. And the attempt here is to show that there have been throughout history, all over the world, in every culture, different ideas about justice, different ideas about human rights, even though they weren't necessarily focused on those words on documents and declared in that way that we've seen, nevertheless, those ideas have existed throughout the world. Some of you come from other cultures and you might know about the history of those cultures and you might recognize some of these ideas in your history. So let's look at some of the precursors of the 20th century human rights documents. 20th century will be the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Precursors are documents that came before, that came prior to the 20th century. So we didn't talk about this, but there were a couple of documents here in England. One was called the Magna Carta, 1215, you can see the date. And that was basically a document that made the king share his power with the nobility. So it limited the power of the king. There were certain things the king couldn't do. The king in England, the king was not an absolute ruler. He was an absolute ruler in France, absolute ruler in Austria, in Russia, the other places, but not in England. After 1215, the king shared some of his power with the nobility. And there was a Bill of Rights in England for the English people. So the commoners did get some rights under the rule of the king as far back as 1789. You can see that's almost 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. And then, of course, the French had their own revolution in 1789 after the American Revolution, and they put forth a Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens, and that also established rights for the citizens, rights for the Frenchmen. Of course, that revolution ended with the takeover of Napoleon. Perhaps you've heard of Napoleon, who was a dictator, basically, and conquered all of Europe with his army. So the Declaration of Rights of Man did not lead to a democracy in the same way that the Declaration of Independence did. And then, of course, the US Constitution. These are all written precursors of today's human rights documents. That's what we're going to read. Many of these documents, when originally translated into policy, excluded women, people of color, members of certain social, religious, economic, and political groups. You know this. Most of the world, we talked about this, there was slavery, and women were property, usually in most societies, up until the 19th century, or maybe even the 20th century. And children, of course, were property well into up until the 20th century. Even today, there is debate about who is responsible for the children. You may have heard about the notion of discussions about transgender and sexuality, gender issues in public schools. And the public schools are basically saying, we have the right to talk to children about these things. And parents, some parents are saying, no, you don't have the right to talk to children about these things. To whom do the children belong? It's a real interesting question. You might answer that in your paper. You might think about that. But in any case, slaves, of course, all over the world, there have been slaves of all different types. And slaves, of course, were excluded from human rights because slavery is a deprivation of basic human rights. Nevertheless, oppressed people throughout the world have drawn on the principles of these documents that these documents express to support revolutions that assert the right to self-determination. So here, the idea is that people, when they're oppressed, when their rights are being deprived, they have often rebelled, had a revolution in order to change the form of government. And this idea of self-determination simply means that people, it's a lot like democracy, people were able to determine for themselves what type of government they should have. Contemporary, this same as our time, contemporary means the same as our time. Contemporary internal human rights law and the establishment of the UN have important antecedents. Antecedents are things that came before. So this is reiterating what was said before, repeating it in a sense. Efforts in the 19th century to prohibit the slave trade, as you well know, in even in the United States in the 19th century, in 1861 to 1864, a civil war was fought in order to, one of the reasons was to eliminate slavery in the United States. And England, prior to that, eliminated slavery throughout the British Empire, even though slavery existed in many other places. And of course, to limit the horrors of war. A code of conduct for war was one of the things that people were discussing. In 1919, so 1919 is the end of the First World War. The First World War was from 1914 to 1990. It's called the World War because every part of the globe was involved and affected by this war. And that was the war in the First World War was a horrible war. millions of people died, both civilians and soldiers, and all kinds of terrible war machines were used, poison gas and airplanes for war, and the machine gun for war, and barbed wire, all trench warfare, all kinds of horrible things happened. And the world was in shock that people could actually treat each other this way and kill each other and destroy each other and fight in this fashion. So the world got together after the First World War and tried to do something about people being so bad to each other. Okay, so here, concern over the protection of certain minority rights was raised by the League of Nations at the end of the First World War. The League of Nations was a worldwide organization that was established after the First World War, just like the United Nations was established after the Second World War. Problem is with the League of Nations, the League of Nations failed. It did not work. One of the main reasons it didn't work was because the United States didn't join. Now, you can imagine how important it was for the United States to be part of a worldwide organization. It's really, really bad because the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, was the one who proposed the League of Nations. And he was Republican. So the Democratic opposition, or maybe he was Democratic and the Republican opposition, I actually can't remember, didn't want to give the president a victory, so they didn't let the country, they didn't vote to join the League of Nations. We've just gone through a political season. We've heard a lot about Democrats, Republicans, the president, and the Congress, and the Senate, the House of Representatives. Some of you may even have voted, which would be great. But this kind of political jockeying has been going on in the United States ever since the inception. Anyway, the League failed to prevent China and Japan invading China. Japan also attacked the United States. It failed to prevent Italy attacking Ethiopia, and it failed to stop Germany and Hitler from the terrible things that occurred in the Second World War. Second World War was 1939 to 1945. So after the Second World War, because of the way the Nazis killed people, they say extermination here, over 6 million Jews and gypsies and Catholics and homosexuals, people with disabilities, they decided that the world would be a better place without all of these people, and they went systematically, had designed to kill them. They killed them in gas chambers, they killed them with machine guns, they killed them any way they could. After the war, there were trials called the Nuremberg trials, where the people who were caught, who could be identified, who were responsible for all these terrible things, were tried for crimes against humanity, crimes against peace. We call them war crimes. This was part of what the United Nations was all about. The governments of the world decided to establish the United Nations. I'm sure you've all heard of the United Nations. And the idea was to have international peace and prevent war. Clearly, the United Nations has not succeeded in preventing war, but nevertheless, it's a noble idea. And people wanted to make sure that never again would there be such horrors as there were in World War II. And here it was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who were pushing very hard for the United Nations, for an organization that would involve everyone in the world and would bring people together at a discussion table instead of with fighting. And you can see I left in here, I'm going to send you these notes, and you can see I left some of the links in here. So if you wanted to check out some of these documents or follow up on any ideas, that's just a fine thing to do. But here you can see that the United Nations was formed in 1945. And so the countries that joined the United Nations are called member states, and here you can see initially 56 states became part of the United Nations. Now there's over 100 states in the United Nations. And here, of course, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was drafted in order to promote the ideas that would have peace and stop people from killing each other the way they were. All right, so there's a little bit more here about human rights, some other documents that you could use if you wanted to for your essays. I left all this stuff in here so you could use this. And as you can see, there's some interesting concepts that are talked about here. And of course, there were all kinds of documents and agreements issued by the United Nations to prevent human rights from being taken away from people throughout the world. So I'm going to leave this in the notes here for you to read on your own. I don't want to keep reading to you. Hopefully I've whetted your appetite about this, and you can see the different ideas that have been put forth with regard to human rights. When we read the actual Human Rights Declaration, we'll go article by article, and you will be able to see some of the similarities with the Bill of Rights and with the Declaration of Independence, and some of the other ideas that the people of the world represented in the United Nations decided that should be in the Human Rights Declaration. So what it is basically is a listing of all the rights that the nations of the world, governments of the world, believe that people all over the world, regardless of where they live, that people should have. So when we read it, we'll go together, we'll go over each article together. You will see the different things that they thought were important to declare as part of human rights for everyone. And you'll be able to consider yourself what human rights you really feel do exist in the world today. When you write your essay, you can certainly write about situations that you know about all over the world or United States where human rights, the ones listed in the Declaration of Human Rights, where human rights are supported or where you feel that human rights might be violated. So some of those human rights articles, they're all very specific. Some of them might surprise you in terms of what they deal with and how they talk about it. And there are, of course, things that you might think of as human rights today that you may not find in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There's a couple of things going on. Your own idea about what human rights are all about, the world's idea of what human rights are, and then situations where human rights are either supported or situations where they're denied. So think about those things as the background for the Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm going to stop talking because I said a lot of stuff. So let me just ask, is there anybody has any questions about what we were just talking about, or anything you want to ask about the human rights idea, anything like that?
Question, Professor. For the source on that document that you just read, is that one of the sources that we're going to be using?
You can use that source. You certainly can. And I put that whole discussion with those links. I put that in the notes, so you'll have it. You'll have it in the notes. But you need 3 sources for this essay, and you can use whatever source in addition to the document itself, the Human Rights Declaration. And so, yeah, you could use that source, or you could use other sources. Depends on what you focus on, right?
So we could use the sources that you'll be, giving us in the links for our essay and stuff, and that will count towards it.
Definitely.
And how long would you want this essay to be? Is it also 500 to 600 words?
Yes, it's exactly the same essay that you've been writing all along in terms of the guidelines.
Okay.
It's better at this point in class to shoot for 600 words rather than 500 words, only because it pushes you to do a little bit more thinking, a little bit more writing. But sure, 500 to 600 words is just fine. And definitely you can use the sources that we provide in class. Really, the sources will depend on what you focus on, what you decide to focus on for your essay, what you choose to write about.
Could I use, could I go to the LaGuardia library and maybe cite some sources from there? If that, is that also acceptable?
That's absolutely, that's more than acceptable. That's recommended. Hear that, everybody? I recommend that you use the LaGuardia library because it's a good idea for you to explore the library and to get used to using the library, because in the future for other classes, you'll need to use the library. So definitely use the library for sources. And you can start exploring those kinds of things already. You don't have to wait till we read the document. You get the gist of what human rights are all about. When we read the document, you'll see all the specific things. By the way, most people are not aware of the actual contents of the Human Rights Declaration. Most people are not aware of what it says in there about specific human rights. And personally, I find it strange, since it's a document that was written for everybody in the world, and it's a document that's supposed to support everybody's rights in the world. I always find it strange when political leaders, you know, presidents and senators and other people, when they're not aware of the human rights that are listed in the Declaration of Human Rights, even though a country like the United States has signed that document and supports that document. So it makes for interesting reading. I won't say more. Any other questions, people? Think you want something on your mind? Most of you have already submitted all your essays. Everybody's up to date as far as I can tell. That's great. I like the way you proceeded to use formal voice and formal structure and formal vocabulary in your writing. Every now and then, still a few things that people need to adjust, but it takes practice. That's what we're here for. Also, most of you are really improved with the works cited and with the citations in text. Again, that's something that you really want to master, because you'll be asked to do that in every other class that you take at the college. And when you've already become familiar with that, then that doesn't become as much of a chore, and you can focus your work on it. And the writing doesn't become so much of a chore, and you can then focus on the content of what you need to write. Yes, I know. Somebody wrote me a note about MLA. I know MLA is hard. In fact, it takes many times of using the MLA format before you can really master it. It really, that's the kind of thing that really does practice. And many of you, when you go on in your other courses, you'll switch, depending on your discipline, like nursing, you're going to switch to APA format, which is slightly different than MLA, but all the principles are really the same. So learning MLA helps you to learn APA as well. Okay, anybody else? Questions, concerns, issues? Okay, that's all I wanted to do with you today. We're going to start reading the Declaration on Wednesday. We'll finish it following Monday, and then you'll have a bit of time off for Thanksgiving, and you can write your essays. Okay, everybody, have a good night.
Have a good night, Professor.
Professor.
Good night, Professor.
Have a great evening, Professor.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good
Bye.
night, Professor.
Good night.